Welcome to the second Tractatus video. In the first video we looked at the preface and the proposition starting with number 1 of Wittgenstein's Tractatus. And in this video we will start with proposition number 2 and go through some of the propositions that fall under that number 2. Proposition number 2 is rather different in the two most well-known translations. The Ogden and Ramsey translation tells us the following. What is the case, the fact, is the existence of atomic facts. And to be honest, even though Wittgenstein may have approved of this translation himself, it doesn't make any sense. What is the case, the fact, is the existence of atomic facts. So the fact is the existence of an atomic fact? I mean, what does that even mean? Here I would say that the Peirce-McGuinness translation is definitely better and also much closer to the original German. Peirce and McGuinness tell us this. They say, what is the case? A fact is the existence of states of affairs. And it is that term, state of affairs, that I will continue using. So a fact is the existence of a state of affairs. A fact, like the fact that I am holding a Nietzsche bust, is the existence of a state of affairs. The state of affairs of me holding the Nietzsche bust. And of course, what this terminology opens up is the possibility to also speak of state of affairs that do not exist, such as the state of affairs that I am holding a Margaret Thatcher bust. Right? I am not holding a Margaret Thatcher bust, but there's a possible state of affairs, one that doesn't exist, which is me holding a Margaret Thatcher bust. And of course we couldn't call that a fact, right? Because a fact is usually something that obtains, that is there. And so by bringing in this idea of state of affairs, Wittgenstein is allowing us to sort of also talk about possibilities and not just about what is actually the case. But as a terminological addition, this would not bring us too much if Wittgenstein didn't say more about what states of affairs are. And luckily he does just that in the next proposition. So, again, following the Peirce-McGuinness translation, here is what 2.01 tells us. A state of affairs, a state of things, is a combination of objects, things. I don't know why they add a state of things between brackets, to be honest. A state of affairs is a combination of objects, things. A state of affairs is a combination of objects. Well, that has a certain intuitive plausibility, right? If me holding the Nietzsche bust is a state of affairs, well, that seems to be a specific kind of combination of at least two objects, me and the Nietzsche bust. The combination being the holding, right? It's me, one object, having a certain relation, holding, to another object, the Nietzsche bust, right? And that is the state of affairs. Well, that makes a lot of sense. So, objects, Gegenstand is Wittgenstein's German word here. Objects are things that occur in state of affairs in which they are connected to or related to other objects in a specific way, thus building up a state of affairs. And when such a state of affairs actually obtains, when it occurs, when it exists, then we have a fact. So that is the basic terminological structure here that Wittgenstein is setting up for us. Now, before going on, I want to spend some time thinking about Wittgenstein's conception of an object, and especially his idea that, well, this is 2.011, that it is essential to things that they should be possible constituents of states of affairs. It is essential to things, or objects, that they should be possible constituents of states of affairs. I think a good first stab, a sort of first model of understanding what Wittgenstein means when he talks about objects or things in this way, is to think of how we learned to talk about and think about atoms in high school chemistry class. So let's take an oxygen atom. Right? How do we learn to think of an oxygen atom in high school chemistry class? Well, we learn to think of it as an O, right? A big capital letter O, with two lines coming out of it. And those two lines are sort of possibilities of connection. And an oxygen atom wants, so to speak, to connect to other atoms with those two lines. And so one of the things that can happen is that it connects to two hydrogen atoms, right? And then we have O with two lines and two H's at the end of those lines, and together it's H2O. It is a water molecule, right? If we understand what an oxygen atom is, we have to understand that it has a certain possibility of connection with it. It has these two possibilities of connection with other atoms, which allows it to turn into a water molecule. Doesn't have to turn into a water molecule, of course, right? Those two lines could also sort of come together and both connect to another oxygen atom, in which case we have a different kind of molecule. We've got an O2, an oxygen molecule, the kind of stuff that we like to breathe in order to not die. It's even possible, I suppose, that this oxygen molecule isn't connected to anything. Sorry, this oxygen atom isn't connected to anything. It's sort of floating out there with its two, possible bonds just being possible, not connected to anything, sort of carrying with it this perpetual possibility of connecting to something. And if I remember my high school chemistry rightly, this would be called an oxygen ion. Now, something like that is the way that Wittgenstein wants to think us about objects in general. And so, for instance, take any spatial object. Any object that is the kind of object that could appear in space. So one example of that would be my Nietzsche bust. Another example of that would be, an oxygen atom actually, or an electron. But not, everything you can think of as an example of a spatial object. Like the number 17 doesn't seem to be an example of a spatial object. It's not somewhere in space. Okay, take a spatial object. Well, a spatial object carries with it, so to speak, the possibility of standing in spatial relations to other objects. Being a spatial object is having the possibility, carrying with you the possibility of standing in specific spatial relations to other objects. So my Nietzsche bust, being a spatial object, has the possibility of standing in the being at 1 meter distance relation to me, right? This Nietzsche bust can be 1 meter distant from me. That is sort of a possibility that it carries with itself. Like the possibility of standing in a certain distance relation to other spatial objects is a possibility that it carries with itself. There are probably all kinds of other possibilities that my Nietzsche bust carries with it. It carries with it the possibility of being colored, of having different colors, having different masses, and so on and so forth. If we want to know what an object is, if an object has really been given to us, if we really understand the nature of an object, then we don't have to understand all the ways that it actually relates to other objects. But we do have to understand the ways that it can relate to other objects. Right? You don't really know what an oxygen atom is if you don't understand that it can chemically bond with other atoms. And you don't really understand any spatial object if you don't understand that it can stand in spatial relations to other things. And conversely, you also wouldn't understand a non-spatial object, like the number 17, if you didn't understand that it couldn't stand in spatial relations to other objects. If somebody tells me that the number 17 is behind me, I would think that they're not talking literally about the number 17 probably, but if they said, no, they really mean the mathematical object, the number 17, and it's behind me, I would think that they're, either they really don't understand what mathematical objects are, or they're sort of losing their mind, right? You can't understand what the number 17 is without understanding that it cannot have spatial relations to other things. And so Wittgenstein can tell us that in logic, nothing is accidental. If a thing can occur in a state of affairs, the possibility of the state of affairs must be written into the thing itself. This is the kind of stuff that I've just been talking about, right? It is not accidental that a specific object occurs in a spatial relation to me, right? The relation of being at 1 meter distance from me. That's not an accident. Well, it might be an accident that it is at exactly a meter distance from me, but it's not an accident that it occurs in some spatial relation to me, that it can occur in a spatial relation to me. Those kinds of possibilities are sort of carried along with the object themselves. They belong to the essence of the object. They belong to what we can call the logical form of the object. And so that is a theme that Wittgenstein is working out here in the first propositions following number 2. That to understand an object is to understand the way that that object can relate to other objects. And this is sort of involved in any logical grasp of the objects. And so, Wittgenstein can tell us in 2.0122 that things are independent insofar as they can occur in all possible situations, but this form of independence is a form of connection with states of affairs, a form of dependence. That sounds kind of mysterious, but we can now understand what Wittgenstein means by it. What he means is that an object, a thing, is not dependent on any state of affairs, right? Let's say something like the Nietzsche bust doesn't depend on being at a certain distance from me, for instance. But it can only be what it is, it can only be a Nietzsche bust by having with it, by carrying with it the possibility of standing in such states of affairs. Right? It wouldn't be a Nietzsche bust if it couldn't be held, or if it couldn't be at a certain distance from me, or if it couldn't be colored. So an object is what it is because it has all these possibilities of standing in certain states of affairs. And that is the sense in which it is dependent on other things. It is dependent on other things in the sense that it is essential to an object that it stands in certain possible relations, or that it possibly stands in certain relations to other things. That is what makes it the kind of object that it is. Now, in 2.0122, Wittgenstein says something that may sound a little bit strange, and it seems to sort of come out of nowhere. What he says is this. He says, between brackets, it is impossible for words to appear in two different roles, by themselves and in propositions. Or maybe we should say by themselves and in sentences. So it's impossible for words to appear in two different roles, by themselves and in sentences. Well, at first sight, that seems completely wrong, right? I could have a word, let's say the word word, and I can just write down the word word. Okay, and there it is, right? By itself. And then I can write down a sentence like, I love to talk about words. Okay, and there's a sentence, and the same word is in it, but now it's in a sentence. Well, that's not quite what Wittgenstein means. What Wittgenstein means is that even that first word, right, where I write down some word like word or horse or apple or whatever, that is only the word it is because it carries with it certain possibilities of appearing in sentences. If I write down the word apple, like, well, at least something that looks to you like the word apple, and I say, well, but this is not the word apple that you find in the sentence, I eat an apple. Because what I've written down here is something that can't be used in a sentence. It's something that doesn't carry with it any possibilities of being used in sentences. Well, then the only serious thing you could say about that is that you have no idea what it's supposed to be that I've written down. Right? It doesn't seem to be a word. And it certainly doesn't seem to be our normal word apple. Because words are what they are because of the ways that they can appear in certain sentences. And so for words too, their identity doesn't depend on being in a specific sentence. Like the word apple doesn't exist because it appears in like a specific sentence about apples. But it is only that word apple because it can appear, it has this possibility of appearing in sentences and in a specific role, in a specific set of sentences. Okay, that's the kind of picture that Wittgenstein is trying to paint for us here. So he can tell us that if he knows an object, he knows all its possible occurrences in states of affairs, because knowing an object is knowing sort of all these possibilities that it carries with it. New possibilities can't be discovered later. And he sort of summarizes this using a new terminology in 2.01231. 2.01231. We're already very deep into this sort of system of numbering, where he says this. He says, if I am to know an object, though I need not know its external properties, I must know all its internal properties. Or as Ogden and Ramsey say, in order to know an object, I must know not its external, but all its internal qualities. So this difference between external and internal properties, or external and internal qualities, is basically the internal properties of an object are the things that it has in itself, right? That it has to have in order to be the object that it is. Those are mostly those possibilities, right? In order to be the object that it is, it has to have all those possibilities that it carries with it. Otherwise, it would be a different object. The external properties are basically the relations that it has to other objects. So this Nietzsche bust has the property that it can be spatially related to other things. That's an internal property, and that is essential to it. It also has the property of being held by Victor Gijsbers. Well, that's an external property. That is not essential to it. It would still be the same Nietzsche bust if I wasn't holding it. I'm no longer holding it. It's still the same Nietzsche bust. So that's the difference between external and internal properties or qualities. And we will meet that again in later on in the text. So this is the picture that Wittgenstein is painting for us in these 2.01 propositions, ending up with the claims that objects contain the possibility of all situations. Objects contain the possibility of all situations. Sachlagen. So that's not the quite thing as state of affairs. This seems to be more broad. If the state of affairs is sort of the atomic thing, the situation is sort of anything that could be the case, including like maybe the entire world might maybe be called a situation. If the objects are given to us, right? Well, in giving an object, I have to tell you, like you can only know an object if you understand all the ways it can relate to other objects. So if all the objects are given to us, we are also automatically given all the ways that objects might relate to each other. And that means that we understand all the ways that they can connect to each other into states of affairs, and therefore into these maybe even bigger things that we call situations. The possibility of all the situations are sort of already there in the objects themselves. That is what Wittgenstein is telling us here. Objects contain the possibility of all situations. And then he goes on to introduce the notion of form. And he says the possibility of its occurring in states of affairs is the form of an object. And so the form of an object is not like its shape. And in fact, form applies also to objects that aren't spatial, so that don't have any shape. The form of an object here is its sort of logical form. It's all the possible kinds of connection that it can have to other things, right? It's what we need to understand the kind of object that it is and the ways that it could appear in states of affairs. All right. Well, so far for the numbers 2.01, but now in 2.02, Wittgenstein is going to make another very important claim about objects. In 2.02, he tells us this: objects are simple, or the object is simple. We recall this, hopefully, from the propositions numbered 1, right, where we were told that these facts, what we saw there was that the facts were supposed to be independent. And so what I said about that is that this means that in some sense they have to be simple, they have to be atomic. They have to be sort of the smallest facts that there are, out of which other bigger facts might be built up. Now Wittgenstein is going to say that again at the level of objects, and he's going to tell us more about it. So what he says is that objects are simple. every statement about complexes, and complexes are things that are not simple, every statement about complexes can be resolved into a statement about their constituents and into the propositions that describe the complexes completely. Having read that, we now understand that my Nietzsche bust was probably not a very good example of an object. At least not an object in the sense that Wittgenstein is talking about. Because my Nietzsche bust is pretty complex. One way to think about it is to think about it as consisting of lots and lots of other objects, like very small particles, that have particular relations to each other, particular spatial relations and particular chemical bonds that together form a sort of complex structure that, because of its spatial properties, is a Nietzsche bust. Right? And if those same particles had had different properties, then they would have formed a Margaret Thatcher bust. I suddenly sort of understand why I, in the spur of the moment, came up with the idea of a Margaret Thatcher bust. Right? I was thinking about busts, and Margaret Thatcher popped up. And I believe that Margaret Thatcher busts are a crucial plot point in one of the episodes of the television series Sherlock. That must be why I mean, it's not that I continually think about Margaret Thatcher in my daily life. Okay, so that's the unconscious for you. Something to remember when we do a course on Freud or Jung. Or I don't know whether we'll ever do a course on Freud or Jung, but who knows. Okay, so my Nietzsche bust is actually not an object, but a complex. It's a lot of smaller objects brought together in a particular way. In order to completely describe my Nietzsche bust, what I could do is describe all these constituents, all the objects, like the simple objects, and describe how all of them together are related in such a way that they form a Nietzsche bust. And that is the kind of procedure that Wittgenstein describes here in 2.0201, right? When he tells us that a statement about complexes, a statement like, I hold the Nietzsche bust, can be analyzed into a statement about all these little simple objects that make up me and that make up the Nietzsche bust, and a certain way that they are related to each other. Okay. Now again, we might want to know from Wittgenstein, what are the simple objects? And Wittgenstein is never going to tell us, right? He's not going to say that, oh, it's the elementary particles, or oh, it's the like primitive elements of your conscious experience, or anything like that, right? He's just agnostic about that. He doesn't tell us. What he thinks that logic shows is that there must be simple objects, but he doesn't claim to know what the simple objects are, and he's never going to tell us. Okay, good to know that in advance. Now, why must there be simple objects? Wittgenstein has a story about that. He says objects make up the substance of the world. That is why they cannot be composite. If the world had no substance, then whether a proposition had sense would depend on whether another proposition was true. In that case, we could not sketch any picture of the world, true or false. This is a very compressed argument, but I believe that what Wittgenstein means is the following. If we want to sketch a picture of the world, we want to form a picture of the world, we need to describe a possible world. If we describe a possible world, then the sentences in which we describe that world need to be not true, right? It's a possible world. If it's not the real world, then some of our sentences won't be true. But they need to be meaningful, right? We need sentences about a possible world that is not the real world to nevertheless be meaningful. Now, Wittgenstein believes, and he hasn't told us here, but he's going to tell us later on, he believes that at the basis of language, right, at the basis of the ability of language to refer to the world, lie names of objects. Now, suppose that those names refer to complex objects. Well, the problem is that complex objects are contingent. That is, they are not necessary. They might exist, but they might also not exist. If those particles that form my Nietzsche bust had not formed my Nietzsche bust, there wouldn't be a Nietzsche bust, right? So the existence of my Nietzsche bust is contingent. And so if everything is complex, then everything is contingent. But that would mean for Wittgenstein that whether a name refers to something is contingent. That for every name, whether it refers to something is contingent. But if whatever a name is trying to refer to doesn't exist, then that name is meaningless. It just doesn't mean anything. Right? The name Victor Gijsbers means something, it means me. The name Victolf Bladudel Gijsbers doesn't mean anything. Right? There's no such thing in the world as a Victolf Bladudel Gijsbers. If I talk about Victolf Bladudel Gijsbers, if I say, well, Victolf Bladudel Gijsbers likes ice cream, that is not a meaningful claim, because there is no such thing as Victolf Bladudel Gijsbers. And so for Wittgenstein, since referring to the world requires names, if there are no simple objects that form sort of the substance of the world, and I'll say a bit more about substance in a moment, that form the substance of the world and that are guaranteed to be there. And so if it's not guaranteed that there are fundamental names that have meaning, then all we are left with are names that are not guaranteed to have meaning. And when we try to describe a possible world, our sentences might not mean anything. They might not describe anything. Whether they would have meaning would depend on whether some other proposition was true. And that would mean that we couldn't actually describe anything. We couldn't describe anything that, wasn't real. So Wittgenstein believes that the very act of describing possibilities, the very act of sort of describing possible ways for things to exist, requires that there is a set of names that are guaranteed to have meaning, because they refer to things that are guaranteed to exist. And those things can't be complexes, because complexes are contingent. They must be simple things. And more than that, they must be simple things that exist necessarily, that just are there, that form the substance of the world. And now I will say a little bit more about substance. In the Western philosophical tradition, substance refers to something that exists independently of anything else. Right? To be a substance is to be absolutely independent of anything else. And that's why many, many philosophers in the Western tradition end up claiming that there's only one substance, which is God. Because only God is really independent of anything else. And everything else depends at least on God. When Wittgenstein says that there must be simple objects and that those simple objects are the substance of the world, I believe that he is claiming that language can only function if there are simple objects that exist necessarily, of which it doesn't make sense that to say that they're contingent, which sort of have to exist, which are there in every possible world. That, I believe, is the argument that Wittgenstein is developing here. And it requires his theory of names, which we will only meet later on, but I believe that that's the argument here. That is not uncontroversial, by the way. Other interpreters of the Tractatus deny that Wittgenstein believes that the objects are necessary, but it seems to me that the most sensible way of reading these 2.02 propositions is in the way that I've been setting out for you. So, this fixed form of the world, its substance, consists of the objects. Objects are just what constitutes this unalterable form. Let me say a few things more. In 2.024, Wittgenstein can say that substance is what exists independently of what is the case. Right? And that's basically what I've just been telling you. Substance are the simple objects. What is the case is the way that these simple objects come together, are connected into states of affairs. So, the fixed, the existent, and the object are one. The object is the fixed, the existent. The configuration is the changing, the variable. Basically, that is the picture that I have been trying to paint for you. The configuration of objects forms the state of affairs. It is the state of affairs. In the state of affairs, objects fit into one another like the links of a chain. Right? That is basically Wittgenstein giving a picture like the oxygen atom picture that I've been giving you in the beginning. Right? These objects are sort of chained together. They come together. They get into relations, and once they get into relations, like spatial relations or chemical bonds or whatever type of relation, that is when they start forming state of affairs. They start forming facts. They start forming things that are contingent, that can be the case or that cannot be the case. Here is something that, again, reminds us of what Wittgenstein tells us at the end of the number ones. At 2.061, he says that state of affairs are independent of one another. From the existence or non-existence of one state of affairs, it is impossible to infer the existence or non-existence of another. And so again, Wittgenstein is telling us that these most simple things, the state of affairs in which these simple objects hang together, must be independent of each other. And he sort of needs that because he is trying to set up a logical picture of the world. And these are the basic elements. These objects which come with these possibilities, and then these possibilities are realized or not. And if that picture is to work, then the realization of those possibilities had better be independent of each other. Because otherwise there would be some structure that forces the objects to combine in certain ways if they are, already combined in other ways. Some kind of structure that isn't part of the story that Wittgenstein has been telling us, and that would be problematic. So he wants those fundamental states of affairs to be independent of each other. And again, just like with the facts in the propositions number one, this is kind of mysterious. It's not very clear what those states of affairs could be. So even if we take something as simple as being at a certain distance from each other, well, objects being at a certain distance from each other doesn't seem to be independent. So let's take three objects, A, B, and C. And suppose that I say, well, here's one state of affairs, A and B are at 1 meter from each other. Here's another state of affairs, B and C are also at 1 meter from each other. And here's a third state of affairs, A and C are at 300 billion kilometers from each other. That doesn't make any sense, right? How could A and B be at 1 meter and B and C be at 1 meter, yet A and C be at 300 billion kilometers? That doesn't make any sense. So those three states of affairs are not independent. And we would really like to know what states of affairs are independent from each other. And again, Wittgenstein is not going to tell us. He seems to assume that, this is possible. It has to be possible because otherwise language couldn't work. But it's a problem. If we have no conception of what those states of affairs could be, then it's a problem. And it's in fact one of the problems that later on in his life is going to make Wittgenstein reconsider the project of the Tractatus and end up defending a very different story about language that he does here. Well, that's where we will end this video. Next time we start with 2.1.